Chapter 3. Learn to rely on God to help you in your witness for Him. I had to learn how to rely on God to help me be an effective witness for Him the hard way. As you may or may not know, I studied with the Jehovah's Witnesses for a bit more than 3 years prior to giving my life to Jesus. The group of people who proselytize for the Watchtower Bible and Tract organization are commonly known as Jehovah's Witnesses. I was ripe for the picking because I had had almost zero religious instruction in my childhood. In fact, about the only thing we prayed for on a regular basis was that my father wouldn't hurt one of us. Plus, I was genuinely seeking answers about life and God. The Jehovah's Witness who met me seemed to embody what I thought Christians were supposed to be like. Kind, considerate, thoughtful, concerned about my spiritual well-being, friendly and studious, especially as it concerned the Bible. In short, I began studying with them in a Bible study at my home, and this eventually led to my attending a Kingdom Hall. I give thanks to Jehovah that He allowed me to see serious contradictions in the study materials from which I was being taught. These apparent contradictions caused me to begin questioning those who were teaching me. Over and over, I was told that the reason I had the questions I brought up concerning the biblical texts was because the answers were found in the original Koine Greek language the New Testament was translated from. This became such a standard answer to most of my questions, which primarily centered around different translations that ironically were often brought to my attention by illustrations used by those who were teaching me, and the seemingly blatant contradictions in what we were being taught from, for example, issues of the Watchtower and Awake magazines, that I decided to begin an informal study of the Koine Greek language. While I would grant that my study wasn't professionally supervised, that is, I didn't go to school but rather chose to seek out study materials on my own, most of which were published by the Zondervan Publishing Company. After a bit more than 2 years of study, I was able to read, fairly fluently, biblical Greek texts as supplied by the Kingdom Interlinear Translation and the Emphatic Diaglott, both published by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society in the early 1980s. During this time of study, I read very few materials that were considered adulterated by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, and none which were written by apostates, i.e., those who had left the Jehovah's Witnesses either voluntarily or who had been disfellowshipped, excommunicated by the same. In fact, I faithfully went to weekly study groups and even began going door to door to proselytize people in hopes that they would accept Jehovah as the one true God. However, as I grew more knowledgeable about the languages in which the New Testament had been written, I grew more discontented with the pat answers that were given and accepted. That the answers were accepted without question by those I considered much more knowledgeable than me disturbed me greatly. Finally, during a Wednesday service, after we'd heard a district overseer teaching on apostasy and the woes of the current world, I began to be very vocal about some questions I had. I figured that the district overseer would be able to answer my questions from a mature standpoint. This same district overseer has since become a true Christian and is therefore considered an apostate by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. While I can't remember the exact questions I began with, I think it had something to do with the way Jesus was supposedly placed on a stake, stauros, and the fact that the Bible in both English and Greek noted that nails, plural, were used to hold his hands on the stake, whereas in every picture I'd ever seen published by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, Jesus' hands were shown placed together in such a way that, like his feet, only one nail, singular, would have been used to hold them, both his hands and feet, to the stake. From there, I went on to inquire as to why it was that the Bible, the New World Translation, and the Emphatic Diaglott quoted Jesus as saying in John chapter 2, verses 18 through 21, that he, Jesus, would raise himself from the grave. The New World Translation translates this passage thusly: "Therefore, in answer, the Jews said to him, 'What sign have you to show us, since you are doing these things?' In answer, Jesus said to them, 'Break down this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' Therefore the Jews said, 'This temple was built in 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he was talking about the temple of his body." The Emphatic Diaglott translates the same passage thusly: "Then the Jews answered and said to him, 'What sign dost thou show us, why thou doest these things?' Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it." Then the Jews said, 46 years has this temple been in building, and wilt thou erect it in 3 days? But he spoke of the temple of his body. I explained that I was concerned with the rendering of John chapter 2, verses 18 through 21, because it seemed to imply at the very least a contradiction of one of 3 Watchtower Bible and Tract Society teachings, and perhaps all 3. That Jesus, who was obviously dead at the time of his crucifixion, somehow had the ability to raise himself from the grave, even though I had been taught repeatedly that Jehovah God alone had raised him. That soul sleep, which is a very important doctrine espoused by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, wasn't real, since it would be obvious that if a person could raise their own bodies from the dead, that they would have to be aware that they had died. That either Jesus was lying or someone else was wrong about the body that was raised from death. I'd been taught for years that once Jesus, the man, had died, that Jehovah God had recreated a body for Michael the Archangel, who we were taught was the pre-incarnate Christ, and that the original body was gone forever. However, this verse seemed to contradict that view. So either Jesus lied or was wrong about being able to raise his own body, or Jehovah God lied to us by presenting a duplicate Jesus, not the same Jesus, to the disciples, or somehow what I'd been taught for the past 3 years was horribly in error. While I asked these questions with all humility, though with a demand for an answer, they ended up being the last 3 in-depth questions I ever got to ask at a Kingdom Hall. The district overseer once again applied the answer of, paraphrased, "Lonnie, you'd understand the intricacies of this passage if you could read the original Greek." When I asked him if he could read the original Greek, he said no. I then told him that I could and proceeded to do so. With every eye on him and me, about 10 Jehovah's Witnesses had gathered around us by this time. He stared at me blankly for a few moments and then motioned for me to follow him. We eventually stopped by the front door of the Kingdom Hall, and I was told, paraphrased, "Lonnie, you've been in the light for some time now. I don't know why it is that you haven't committed yourself fully to Jehovah God and been baptized, but it seems to me that you've been studying apostate literature. Your questions are causing many here to question the truth that Jehovah God has revealed to them. So I'd like to ask you to leave and not return until you are ready to come under the tutelage of an elder who will then guide you back into the light." He opened the door and motioned for me to leave, and that was that. I was out. I remember standing outside the Kingdom Hall door completely stunned. These people were the only Christians I knew, and yet they just kicked me out of their community. I left with such distaste for anything remotely resembling Christianity that it would be difficult for me to adequately explain. I decided that if Jehovah would allow this to happen, I didn't need him. Thankfully, he hadn't given up on me. To make a long story shorter, I'll be explaining what brought me back to God later in this book. I eventually gave my life to Jesus and became a true student of his word. Now that you have some background information on my religious background, I'll get to the point of this chapter. The comma that saves. I'd been a Christian for approximately 2 years when Dave approached me and began asking me questions about the Jehovah's Witnesses. It turned out that the same person who had introduced me to the organization had been proselytizing his wife, and she was considering becoming one of Jehovah's baptized witnesses. While I really truly loved the lady, Diane, the Jehovah's Witness who'd originally talked to me about her religion, who was speaking to Dave's wife, Jordan, I also knew that Jordan and Diane, and perhaps even Dave, were being led down a path that wasn't godly at all. He asked me if I'd mind coming over to his home to discuss some of the issues that Diane and I disagreed about. I jumped at the chance. The night I arrived at Dave's and Jordan's home, I was, to use a euphemism, loaded for bear. It took me 3 trips to my car to get everything that I'd brought from my debate with Diane. I had the New World Translation, the Emphatic Diaglott, the Kingdom Interlinear Translation of the Greek Scriptures, a King James Version Bible, a New International Version Bible, and a New American Standard Bible, along with Greek and Hebrew lexicons, New and Old Testament dictionaries, and approximately 500 photocopied sheets of WTBTS documents dating back to the late 1800s. In other words, I was prepared to debate, and I was going to win. At this point, I think it's only fair to note that in preparing for what I considered was going to be a battle royal, me against a satanic organization, I hadn't taken the time to truly pray for God to show up and for Him to be glorified. Instead, this debate was all about me and what I had learned. In other words, I went to the debate with an ego that was so inflated that it blinded me to the fact that God loved everyone who was going to be participating in studying His Word. As we began, it became extremely clear that Diane was woefully unprepared for the ammunition I'd brought to the discussion. At first, she seemed perplexed over the fact that I was so forceful in arguing against the belief she knew that I'd been taught years before. But after about an hour, her perplexities soon turned into outright defiance, and we began to debate in earnest. Honestly, I was thrilled to have the chance to put Diane in her place, and I did my very best to do exactly that. I was keeping score mentally, and after we'd gone through around 15 doctrinal issues, I figured that I was winning 15-0, or at the very least 14-1. I was whipping out scriptures as fast as she was and introducing documents as if I were an attorney, and my life depended on this one debate. 2 hours into the debate, I noticed that Jordan had almost completely tuned out. She was only half listening to what we were saying. Dave, on the other hand, was still fully connected. That was enough of an audience for me. I turned the intensity up a notch by beginning to talk about the false prophecies that had been preached by the WTBTS for years that had never come about. Somehow, this led to our talking about the prophecy of Jesus' resurrection and then soul sleep. I don't remember how we got around to the verse, but we ended up discussing Luke chapter 23, verse 43. This verse reads differently depending on whether you read it from the New World Translation or any standard English translation. The difference is where the comma is placed in the verse. And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." New American Standard Bible. And he said to him, "Truly I tell you today you will be with me in paradise." New World Translation. And he said to him, "Indeed I say to thee, this day thou shalt be with me in paradise." Emphatic diaglot. Diane and I talked about this verse at length. The main thrust of her argument was that the comma had been placed after the word today because those who translated the New World Translation knew that Jesus wasn't talking about an event that was going to take place that very day. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society teaches the unbiblical and indefensible doctrine of soul sleep. I was quick to point out that if one were to study how the phrase "truly I say to you," Greek amen soi lego, is used, you'd find it occurs 74 times in the Gospels and is without exception, used as an introductory expression. I also pointed out that in 73 out of the 74 times the phrase occurs, even the New World Translation places a break, such as a comma, after the phrase, "Truly I tell you." The only exception to this in the New World Translation is Luke chapter 23, verse 43. I argued that the reason for this discrepancy was because if they were to place a break before the word "today" in Luke chapter 23, verse 43, it would ultimately destroy the eschatology, the study of end times, they teach. I then noted that even in the emphatic diaglot, the translator, Benjamin Wilson, placed the comma before the phrase "this day." After 15 minutes of looking up the other 73 occurrences of the phrase, which I had conveniently printed out from the New World Translation, Diane quickly changed the subject and I went right along with her. 10 minutes after leaving the subject of Luke 23:43 and soul sleep, Diane and I were in deep argument about something else, and Dave interrupted us for the first time in over 2 hours. Even as Diane and I were debating, I had noticed that he'd been flipping through the various Bibles I had brought along with the others he had in his own home. His search culminated in him asking, "I have a question about the comma in Luke 23:43. Why is it that it's placed before the word "today" in every other Bible, except the New World Translation?" Once again, Diane and I explained the reasons for the change, and once again I thought that I'd handily won the discussion. Diane, apparently not wanting to explore the reasons for the differences in the translations, hurriedly moved on to another subject. But Dave just wouldn't leave Luke 23:43 alone, and over the course of the next 30 minutes, he brought us back to it twice more. Frankly, by the time I'd gotten through explaining the reasons the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society had decided to place the comma where they did in Luke 23:43 for the third time, I was getting really annoyed at Dave. I thought to myself, man, it's just a comma. Get over it. I mean, really, we're talking about the Trinity, which is much more important than a comma. To make a long story much shorter, after 3 hours of intense debate, we decided to call it a night. I packed up all the stuff I'd brought, minus most of the photocopied pages from the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society's articles, which I left for Dave and Jordan to go over at their leisure, gave all them a hug and left. I was convinced that I had done an exemplary work for God and had won the vast majority of points Diane and I had discussed. All in all, I was extremely proud of my knowledge and ability to present the same. Fast forward 2 months. I was in a break room when Dave found me. He came to me, shook my hand, and with a big smile on his face told me, Jordan and I have stopped going to the Kingdom Hall, and we've both committed our lives to Jesus Christ, who we now know as God. I remember feeling a swell of pride in my chest, and as I sat back in my chair, I asked him, so what was it that made you change your mind? I was fully anticipating having my ego massaged that day. I was waiting for Dave to wax poetically about my oratory and debating skills and for him to thank me for teaching he and his wife what the Bible truly said. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 18 states emphatically that pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Until that day, I had no idea that the destruction or the fall could happen to one who sincerely believed he or she was doing God's work. Dave answered, it was that comma in Luke 23:43. I just couldn't get past it, so I started looking at everything else the Watchtower had written and found that a lot of things were like that comma. The comma? A comma had driven 2 people to the cross of Jesus Christ and his love. A comma? Seriously? I couldn't believe Dave didn't mention anything at all about my skillful dissection of the WTBTS theology or my expertise in Scripture. Instead, it was a comma, a lowly, simple, small, tiny mark in a Bible with some 770,000 words that had been used by God to take this husband and wife from pre-Christians to Christians. From those who were destined to spend eternity in hell to those who would be beside me and all other brothers and sisters in Christ in heaven forever and ever. Dave left the break room soon after his comments, and as I sat by myself, the Holy Spirit convicted me of my pride by bringing to mind Mark 5:18, which tells us, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Interestingly enough, Mark chapter 5 verse 18 was one of the scriptures I'd went over with Diane that night in arguing for the correct placement of the comma. I broke down in tears when I realized that I had nothing to do with the conversion experienced by Dave and Jordan. The tears I wept were bitter and sweet. Bitter because I realized I had embarrassed myself before Almighty God by not relying on Him to speak through me, and sweet because from that day on, I knew I'd never forget the story of the comma that saves. With this being said, I'd like to tell you about another conversion story I was allowed to be part of, simply because I did what the Lord told me to do and no more. Jose, a former homosexual, turns his life over to Jesus. Jose and I met during one of the hospital visitations I made in 2009. Honestly, I didn't remember meeting him. It's one of the things I have to cope with since I suffer from short-term memory loss. Fortunately, he remembered meeting me, and thankfully, as Jose tells the story, I allowed him to meet Jesus. In actuality, God simply allowed me to be there when he introduced himself to Jose. In Jose's own words, here's what happened. Note: with Jose's permission, I've restructured the original letter he sent to me so that it reads less like a letter written directly to me and more like prose. Also, for the sake of propriety, I've taken out a few of the more illicit references Jose made in his letter as it relates to his former lifestyle. I met when Lonnie came to see John, a friend of mine. I remember seeing a short little white guy I'd never met coming into John's hospital room and thinking, who is this guy? Anne, John's fiancée, introduced him as Pastor Lonnie, and I thought, oh man, just what I need, a Bible thumper. At the time, I didn't see anything wrong with my attitude, but not long after Lonnie and I finished talking, I realized that I was more worried about what a minister was going to say to me than I was about John's health. In other words, I realized that I was very self-centered. But I'm getting ahead of the story. I was the first person Ann introduced to Pastor Lonnie, and I expected him to be repulsed by all the piercings I had. My nose, eyebrow, and lips all had piercings at the time, and I was very proud of them. Not only that, but I was a gay man, and I'd never tried to hide that fact from anyone, including my uncle Antonio, who was also a pastor. Antonio and I had had a lot of conversations over the past 15 years concerning my homosexuality. Actually, they were more shouting matches rather than conversations. Antonio, who did a lot of work with the underprivileged in our community, could never bring himself to look at me with anything except disgust. He told me that homosexuality was an abomination to God, and he seemed to never be able to see past the fact that I was gay, to also see that I was his nephew and a person. To me, it seemed that I was always Jose, my gay nephew, rather than just Jose, my nephew. Anyway, since I was trying to be respectful for the sake of my friends, John and Ann, I stuck my hand out to shake his, but unexpectedly Lonnie bypassed my hand and arm and gave me a hug. I couldn't believe it. To say that I was shocked would be an understatement. No one ever hugged me, not even my own father and mother. I can't tell you how long it's been since anyone has hugged me. Even the lovers I've had during my life have rarely been able to get close enough to me to actually give me a hug like Pastor Lonnie did. It seems that I was the one who was shaken up, not him. As soon as he'd hugged everyone in the room and told us that Lonnie had died, gone to heaven, and came back, I remember rolling my eyes and deciding it was time for me to leave. So, as soon as he bowed his head to pray, I quickly and quietly left the room. 20 minutes later, I'd made my way to the hospital cafeteria and was having a cup of tea when guess who walks in? Pastor Lonnie. Even though I'd slunk down in the booth I was sitting in and averted my eyes from his direction, I felt a quick pat on my shoulder as he walked by and heard him say, "Hey, Jose, mind if I join you for a minute or two?" I politely nodded yes, but inwardly I dreaded the fact that I was going to have to spend any time at all with a minister. Quicker than I would have liked, Lonnie had returned from getting a cold drink and was back at the booth, sitting directly in front of me. I was taken aback by the fact that he seemed to smile a lot and that when he talked to me, it wasn't all Bible this and Bible that, but instead real conversation. He asked how long I'd known John and Ann. I said I'd known them for 6 years. He asked whether or not I was from the area. I told him I wasn't, and then he did something I didn't expect at all. He asked me how long I'd been gay. I couldn't believe he was that bold. When I told him all my life I was expecting him to start preaching to me, but all he did was nod his head and stop talking. We must have sat there for about 5 minutes with him just smiling at me. Every now and again he would take a sip from his cup, but other than this he didn't try to engage me further. The smile never left his face. It was a little annoying and very unsettling. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, so I asked very defensively, "So do you or your God," I emphasized the word as I said it, "have a problem with me being gay?" Still smiling, he said, "Yes, but we are both certain you can change." That ticked me off. I rose up to my fullest height, and even though we were still sitting, I was at least a foot taller than him. He's quite short. And I loudly asked, "So, you're both certain that I can change, are you? Well, why in hell should I want to change?" I remember that once I'd said this, Pastor Lonnie slowly stopped smiling, looked down at the table as if he were trying to see through it, and then he looked back at me with a concerned look on his face and said, "Not because of hell. Heaven's the reason God and I want you to change." For a long moment he was quiet, and I was so shocked at the sincerity in his voice that I didn't say anything either. Then he asked, "Do you mind if I tell you my story?" Since I didn't say no, he began to tell me about his childhood, his teen years, and his early adulthood. To my utter surprise, Lonnie was very open and honest. He talked to me as if I were his friend instead of someone he'd just met. He talked about all the ways he used to sin and some of the ways he still did, and then he told me about his death, his trip to heaven, and what he's been doing since coming back. Then, Lonnie told me something that no other Christian had ever said to me, at least not in the way he did. He said, "You already know that homosexuality is considered to be wrong by God, but did you know that any form of sex outside of marriage is considered a sin? The Bible tells us that any sin you and I might commit are all condemnable acts in the eyes of God because all of them will send us to hell. Did you know that God is fair enough that he'll punish a straight man for having consensual sex with a straight woman as much as he'll punish a gay man or a gay woman for having sex outside of marriage?" Honestly, I never knew that the Bible said that. Anyway, at about 3 a.m., I began crying and I asked Jesus into my heart. I told him that I knew that being gay was wrong, that I wanted to change, and that I wanted him to be proud of me. Afterwards, I felt cleaner than I ever had. I know that for years upon years, even when I was engaging in homosexuals acts that felt good, I knew in the back of my mind that something was wrong. I just never knew what it was. Now, today, I've been clean for months. What I mean is that I've not even had a sexual thought about a man or a woman either. Lonnie says that one of these days I may have an urge to see men again, but he also tells me that if I remember who Christ is in my life and I run from the urge, God will give me the strength to resist the urge. Anyhow, on that Saturday night I became a Christian. My commitment to Jesus has changed my entire life. I've distanced myself from many of my old friends, most of whom were living a homosexual lifestyle, by actually moving from the city in which I used to live. I've even had words with my Uncle Antonio, who now understands why it is he wasn't ever able to get past my defenses. Most importantly, I now understand what the old saying about people not caring how much you know until they know how much you care really means. Pastor Lonnie showed me a side of Christ that I'd never seen before the day I'd met him. Since becoming a Christian, I've met with Pastor Lonnie, and he set me up with a group of Christians who specialize in helping men and women who, like me, want to beat the gay lifestyle. He also suggested a church I should look into, and when I did, I admit I was scared to death that no one would want me to be in their building with them. I was happily surprised. Not only did they accept me, I still had spiky hair, a tattoo, and all the piercings. They seemed genuinely happy that I was there. The Christians I've met in my church seem truly committed to helping me and those I've introduced to Jesus who are living in sin, not necessarily homosexuality, to show them the love of Jesus I have experienced. Since becoming a member of the family of Christ, I've taken out every piercing I had because they represented the old me, and I've got a haircut. No one told me to do any of this. I just feel it's better this way. I love Jesus, and I know he loves me and you. As an addendum to Jose's story, I'm happy to announce that after 2 years of being a truly committed Christian, God put a lady in his life. Since that time, they've gone from being good friends to being engaged to be married. Sheila and Jose have begun premarital counseling at the church they attend, and they are planning to be wed in early 2013. The purpose of my including this testimony is to show you, the reader, that more often than you might think, it's not what you say, but what you do when you're witnessing that makes an impact on the heart of those you're ministering to.